No system of philosophy or theology, no precise intellectual structure can ever fully embrace the mystical experience of God. Not only is the divine spirit as living and ungraspable as the wind, but the experience itself contains paradoxical elements which no ordinary logical procedure can reconcile. While we cannot hope for a theology which explains it, we may be able to invent one which neither suspects nor contradicts with it a theology in real sympathy with mysticism. Among the reasons for which the prevailing theology has been dubious of mysticism is that theology sets so great a value upon precise and divinite beliefs and their necessity for salvation. This is partly due to the fact that a certain type of mind is frightened by the mutability, the elusiveness, and the mystery of life, and thinks of salvation as a state of everlasting fixity and certainty from which the disconcerting elements of spontaneity, surprise, and mystery are largely removed. Yet in these same elements, another type of mind discerns the activity of a living spirit. For him, salvation is an entire union with and acceptance of this mysterious spirit, and with the expression of its liveliness and spontaneity in the elusive pulse of life as we experience it from day to day. For this type of minded ecstasy is death, and instead of trying to catch and possess the wind of the Spirit, he lets it blow freely around and through him, meaning peace, joy, and salvation in its very movement. He surrenders the desire to possess it in any state or form and lets it possess him, affirming and joining in its unceasing and ungraspable movement, as in some divine dance or melody. It is not that spirit comes or goes, shifts or changes in itself. Like the present moment, it is elusive when the mind tries to pursue and hold it. The true movement is in its creative expressions, in the activity of spirit rather than the agent, and this movement is not so much the quest for an attainment as a dance celebrating fulfillment. God is himself unmoved or motion source, and in union with him the mystic feels with Dante that ma già volgeva il mio desiro il velle sì, come rota, cegualmente è mossa l'amor che muove il sole e l'altre stelle. 6. Sometimes the mystic feels that this spirit, this ultimate reality, is inseparable from the immediate contents of daily experience, and on the basis of this intuition is often erected the theology of pantheism or immanentism. At other times, he experiences reality as something immeasurably other than himself and all created things, as a being infinitely great, holy, and splendid, before whom the world as we know it appears ugly, gross, and evil. From this intuition comes the theology of transcendence, or else the common corollary of pantheism, the doctrine of the illusory universe. Again, there are times when reality presents itself to him as something so alive and intelligent that he feels himself to be in communion with a person. At other times, he is so impressed with its infinitude and mystery that anything so suggestive of man as personality seems an unthinkable limitation. All of these apparently paradoxical elements will have their place in a truly complete mysticism, in a full experience of union with God. If the union is to be perfect, God must be in the most intimate and inseparable union, not only with the soul, but also with its entire experience of life and the world. But if that with which the soul is united is to be God, he must at the same time be innately above, beyond, and other than the soul and the world. Furthermore, if God is the source and height of liveliness and creative power, he cannot be anything less than a person, since a law or principle is simply an automatic, mechanical, and dead mode of behavior. On the other hand, if God is the ultimate reality, the one source of all things, he must be free from the limitations of personality as we know it, and must not be subject to the mutability and the limitations of the forms in which his creative activity is expressed. To these essential paradoxes or antinomies of religious experience must be added another both mystical and philosophic. The human mind is profoundly dissatisfied with any form of absolute dualism, with a religion or a metaphysic, for which ultimate reality is not one and undivided. The dissatisfaction not only felt with such crude dualisms as the Zoroastrian contrast of ultimate light and ultimate darkness, or Mosd and Ahriman, or the Manichaean dualism of spirit and matter. As we have seen, it is even felt with the monotheistic dualism of creator and creature ex nihilo. On the other hand, reason and the moral sense rebel at pantheistic monism, which must reduce all things to a mooted uniformity and assert that even the most diabolical things are precisely God, thus destroying all values. No forms of compromise or via media can resolve these antinomies because mystical experience presents them to us in the most extreme and contrasted manner. Compromise would altogether destroy their vitality and power over human life, nor can we divide these elements as the sheep from the goats and term some of them true mysticism and others false, for this would be a ridiculous simplification. Yet compromise or division has been the traditional method of Christian theology. There are two reasons for this. Firstly, the theological mind, which above all things seeks definition, precision, and fixity, has the most intense difficulty in accepting the mystery of paradox and the terrible uncertainty as to ultimate truth, which it seems to involve. Secondly, the reasoning processes of the Western mind, grounded as they are in Greek logic, can never be happy with a profound antinomy. A proposition must be true or false, and X cannot at the same time be both Y and not Y. On the whole, traditional theology has leaned principally to the theology of transcendence of God's holiness and otherness. After the Renaissance, to meet the rise of humanism, it combined the stress on transcendence with an increased emphasis on the personality of God as this was revealed in the divine humanity of Jesus. Theology and spirituality became more and more Christocentric and at the same time quite alien to the traditions of Christian mysticism. Contemplation as understood by the medieval mystics was replaced by imaginative and imaginative devotion to the humanity of Jesus. 7. From the standpoint of mysticism, this was a disaster based on a misunderstanding of the incarnation, for it made the divine humanity transcendent and humanized the mystery of God. It frustrated the very purpose of the incarnation because, in practice, it did not raise humanity to union with God. It raised only the historic Jesus. 8. God was made at once transcendent and anthropomorphic, and with such a God, mysticism is impossible, because it makes him as remote, or rather infinitely more remote, than another human being. Medieval mysticism, as we viewed it in The Cloud of Unknowing, in Eckhart Tolle, the Victorines, Rispertialien, even as late as Dennis, the Carthusian Slink, John of the Cross, and Augustine Baker, is little concerned with devotions to the humanity of Jesus, yet the intensity and intimacy of the union with God which it experiences can only be justified in a Christian context by the doctrine of the Incarnation. For in the words of St. Athanasius, God became man, that man might become God, 9, and it is precisely on the basis of the Incarnation, its revelation of the eternal function of the Word, 10, and its realization of God's union not only with Jesus but with man and all creation, that there is room for a complete mysticism in Christianity. When, however, theology tries to achieve a compromise between immanence and transcendence, Both are deprived of their end. God is not quite immanent and not quite transcendent. The world conceals his omnipresent being like a veil. He is in all things, but not thoroughly united with them, just as water is not fully united with the jar which contains it, because the substance of the water and the substance of the jar are mutually exclusive. In this sense, God and the world are simply mixed. They may even interpenetrate to some degree, like air and dust, but still, they are mutually exclusive. But if God and the world are mutually exclusive, God does not actually transcend the world, because mutually exclusive entities must belong to the same order of being. For example, diamond shapes are mutually exclusive, and although a square can be put inside a circle, it cannot be fully united with it. A square can in no sense be a circle. But color is wholly other than shape, and there is no mutual exclusiveness between a circle and redness. Color can no more be described in terms of shape than God can be described in terms of created things. Yet although the color red is quite other than the shape circle, there is a sense in which a circle can be red. 11. The analogy of color and shape goes some way to solving the problem, showing us that the completeness of God's union with a creature depends on his very transcendence. But the analogy and the solution to the problem which it suggests has three disadvantages. Firstly, it leads us to think of God as a substance out of which things are made, as medias might be cut out of paper or wood. It would follow from this that creatures are so many forms of God's shapes of color. This gives us, secondly, the disadvantage of suggesting that God's immanence in creatures circumscribes him. Thirdly, a transcendence or otherness of this type would seem to eliminate all possibility of God having any influence on the creature, or even of creating it. Color is not a sequence of shape. Beauty or intensity of color would in no way be able to inhibit beauty or clarity of shape. The two orders of being touch, they may even coincide. The presence of the latter may even be shown to depend on the former. But there the relationship ends. There can be, as it were, no understanding, no communion, no passage of imbuance between the two. Here we have in principle the same difficulty that we found in the idea of the creation of the world, ex nihilo. We do not see how it can possibly be done, but we are doing our best to safeguard the transcendence of God. For practical purposes, mystical religion has always tended to insist that man and the world must be utterly united with God, must in some sense be God. In the words of the unknown author of The Cloud, for he is thy being, and in him thou art what thou art, not only by cause and by being, but also he is in thee, both thy cause and thy being, and therefore think of God in thy work as thou dost on thyself, and on thyself as thou dost on God, that he is as he is, and thou art as thou art, so that thy thought be not scattered nor separated, but owned in him that is all evermore, saving this durance betwixt thee and him that he is thy being, and thou art not his. He is being both to himself and to all, and that only is he separated from all, that he is being both of himself and of all, and in that is he one in all and all in him, that all things have their being in him, as he is the being of all. 12, or as Catherine of Genoa put it, my being is God, not by simple participation, but by a true transformation of my being, and again, my me is God, nor do I know my selfhood except in God. 13. The eye with which I see God, said Eckhart, is the same eye with which God sees me. My eye and God's eye is one eye and one sight and one knowledge and one love. Horfikion, and again, when a man goes out of himself to want or fetch God, he is wrong. I do not want God outside myself, nor conceive him excepting as my own, and in me a man ought not to work for any why, not for God, nor for his glory, nor for anything at all that is outside him, but only for that which is his being, his very life within him. 15. Upon the certainty of this union with God depends the entire joy power and world-transduring character of the mystical experience. Here, too, is the source of the mystic's vivid sense of spiritual freedom. He is one with God, and neither height nor depth, neither principalities nor powers can break this union. The mystic knows that he has it in spite of himself, that it is God's gift, and that it is given quite irrespective of his merits, and despite his total unworthiness. Yet his very gratitude for the gift will demand expression in worship and self-oblation acts that can only be directed to a transcendent God, to one other than himself, and infinitely exceeding him in holiness and glory. The attractive feature of pantheism is just that it imparts this sense of certain and unbreakable union with God. But its danger and falsity is that it excludes any basis for worship and gratitude. For in pantheism, union with God is an automatic necessity. It is not a gift. On the other hand, the extreme of transcendental theism reduces the divine gift to mere justification. That is, the chance for a new start after the remission of past sins, coupled with the grace to imitate the divine life more perfectly. God is here, assisting man to become one with him by analogy only. There is no union of natures. Thus, for the theology of pure transcendence, union with God is a goal not yet achieved, save in rare instances of great saintliness and grace. It implies that those who have attained it have done so either through their own merits and exhorts, or else that they are special objects of divine favoritism. Not only does this view encourage spiritual pride, but it raises the question as to how a human soul can rise to God unless it actually has been kind of will, or at least rot. Considerisen giiten uitkwam de kiptomotion van CC. Not only does this view encourage spiritual pride, but it raises the question as to how a human soul can rise to God unless it need or has God. Console thyself, wrote Pascal Thornville, wouldest not seek me if thou hadst not found me? 16. But in the view of the mystic's union with God is a present fact to be realized rather than attained. It is neither to be earned nor is it a result of special favoritism. It is given to all to be realized, appreciated, and used just as God maketh his sun to rise upon the evil and on the good, and sendeth his rain upon the just and upon the unjust. Almost all mysticism, whether Western or Eastern, 17, has the sense of the givenness of union with God, of its eternal reality, which has to be accepted and recognized, not achieved. In the words of Riesbrock, in his created being, the soul incessantly receives the impress of its eternal archetype, like a brideless mirror in which the image remains steadfast, and in which the recollection is renewed without interruption by its ever-new reception in new light. This essential union of our spirit with God does not exist in itself, but it dwells in God, and it owes forth from God, and it depends upon God, and it returns to God as to its eternal origin. And in this wise it has never been nor ever shall be separated from God, for this union is within us by our naked nature, and were this nature to be separated from God, it would fall into pure nothingness. And this union is above time and space and is always and incessantly active according to the way of God. But our nature, for as much as it is indeed like unto God, but in itself is creature, receives the impress of its eternal image passively. This is that nobleness which we possess by nature in the essential unity of our spirit, where it is united to God according to nature. This neither makes us holy nor blessed, for all men, whether good or evil, possess it within themselves, but it is certainly the best cause of all holiness and blessedness. 18. This extreme immanentism, or quasi-pantheism of the mystics, only becomes a problem when we try to consider the mystical experience from the strictly logical standpoint of theology. In practice, the mystic does not enter into conflict in his experience of God, nor, save in comparatively rare instances, does his sense of being one with God destroy his sense of values. This remains true even when mysticism is related to such an extremely immanentist theology as Hindu Vedanta or Mohammedan Suism. He may say to himself, with the Upanishads, "Thou art Brahman," but he does not then proceed to claim omnipotence and omniscience. Even supposing this to be pure pantheism, the moral blindness which most theologians attribute to the pantheist is largely theoretical. It might well arise if the pantheist were not a mystic, but a mystical pantheist is scarcely ever a consistent and logical pantheist, because he is trying to describe a relationship to God, which is not in fact pantheism, although it seems to be when he uses theological terms. But formal and obediential theology will take cognizance of his views and attempt to pass judgment upon them as if they were statements of dogma. The mystic, however, knowing that he cannot describe his experience exactly, has not tried to make a dogmatic statement. He uses theological language only because he is talking about God, because there is no other language available and appropriate. His statements are poetic rather than dogmatic, and it is as absurd to take them literally as to imagine that the poet really means that his beloved has cherries for lips and ravens' wings for hair. Theology, however, is always reluctant to admit the limitations of its language and disturbed to see it used with such alarming liberty. The very foundation of mysticism, writes Bodiaev, is an inner kinship or union between the human spirit and the divine, between creation and the Creator. It implies the overcoming of transcendence and that sense of God and man being external to one another. Thus, mysticism is always concerned with the immanence rather than the transcendence of God, an immanence, moreover, which is actually experienced. This is why mysticism always employs terms which differ from those of theology, and is why in theological circles mysticism is always suspected of heretical tendencies. But mysticism is of such a profound nature that we cannot apply to it the more superficial criteria of heresy. Mystics are always suspected of pantheistic leanings, and indeed when an attempt is made to understand them rationally and to translate their experience into the terms of theology or metaphysics, they certainly do come very near to pantheism. Yet while pantheism is in reality a highly rationalistic doctrine, mysticism uses paradoxical and apparently contradictory expressions, because for the mystics, both the identity between the creature and the Creator and the gulf which separates them are both equally facts of existence. Mysticism cannot be expressed either in terms of pantheistic monism or of theistic dualism. 19, unless therefore we can find some terms other than pantheistic monism or theistic dualism, there can be no vital relationship between mysticism and Christian theology. The highly desirable goal of a presentation of Christian doctrine interpreted by mystical religion will be impossible. The two must simply agree to leave one another alone. The mystic must agree not to give the impression of speaking dogmatically, and the theologian must agree not to judge mystical pronouncements by his own standards, and yet permit the mystic to use theological terms in his peculiar illogical and paradoxical manner. Fortunately, however, terms can be found, and although they may not completely bridge the gap between mystical and theological pronouncements, they give a more satisfactory result than anything hitherto employed, and far more satisfactory than mere agreement to remain aloof. Language and intellectual thought, we must repeat, can never so embrace and describe the mystical experience that it may be communicated from one soul to another by mere words and ideas. But theology can adopt a principle of thought which will in great measure resolve the antinomy of transcendence and immanence, monism and dualism, without resort to compromise. This will not involve the acceptance of any new dogma, but of a new method, a new type of logic and technique of thought, which will not only resolve the antinomy, but will also illumine the very rationale of mystical experience. The root of the difficulty is that Western theology and philosophy, grounded as it is in Greek thought, has an inadequate conception of the unity of God. Our logic, our method of reasoning, is entirely dualistic, and therefore cannot, without contradictions, treat of a being who surpasses duality. The unity of God is therefore seen as opposed to multiplicity in God. God has no opposite, and yet we apply to him the term unity in a sense which has an opposite, for unity, as we conceive it, is unthinkable without the contrast of multiplicity. But we Shindan sought a method which surpasses dualism insofar as the intellect is capable of so doing. This method is developed in Sanghara's Advaita Vedanta and in Mahayana Buddhism. Neither of these two systems carry the method to a conclusion which would satisfy the Christian, because they are working with basic material, i.e., revelation, which he would deem inadequate. But this need not concern us, for what is important is the method itself, and not the use which Vedantists and Buddhists have made of it. To some extent, the quest of Vedanta is the same as that of Christianity, namely the transcending of dualism, the realization of union with God. Both are agreed that God is the one supreme reality, and that no second reality stands over against him on an equal footing, imposing any limitation upon him. God has no opposite. This is a subscient basis of agreement for the Indian method to have relevance for Christianity. Our difficulties is that while admitting the non-duality of God, we apply terms to him in a dualistic sense. We speak of him rightly as one, but then go on to reason from the term as if it were to be used in an exclusive and privative sense. 20. The method itself, which is an intellectual analogy of the mystic way, is a process of reaching, as nearly as may be, to the idea of pure non-duality, which, as will appear, is not at all the same thing as oneness in the monastic sense. It is at the same time a searching critique of the dualism of every idea of unity that falls short of pure non-duality, a critique which very swiftly disposes of pantheistic monism. It starts with one item of data, one revealed dogma, which is the same for Vedanta as for Christianity. God is that which has no opposite. He is one without a second. 21. All created things have opposites whereby they are conditioned and limited. All creatures are of a mutually exclusive character. their relations to each other. For this is not that I am not thou light, is not darkness, red is not blue. But God transcends creatures in the sense that nothing has power to exclude him, to set any boundaries to his being and power. He is absolutely free of every external restraint. In a peculiar and profound sense, God is all-inclusive. There is nothing outside him, for had he any outside, he would have limitations and would not be in buoyant relations. It may be shown then that God has a power which no creature as such possesses, the power to be what he is not to other himself. If this can be shown, it will, on the one hand, entirely fool the mystic's intuition that God is all in all and that the universe is one with him. On the other hand, it will also account for the other aspect of his intuition, which is that individual things are not lost and obliterated in the unity of God, but transfigured, seen as more perfectly and uniquely themselves. For if the unity of God is truly all-inclusive and non-dual, it must include diversity and distinction, as well as oneness. Otherwise, the principle of diversity would stand over against God as something opposite to and outside him. This inclusion of diversity is impossible for the God of pantheism, who cannot comprehend real diversity. The universe of the pantheist is unreal. Thus, the logic of non-duality makes short work of pantheism. If all things are in reality one thing, God, such oneness is exclusive, dual, and limited, because it excludes real multiplicity. The very concept of oneness is a term of duality, because it is inconceivable apart from the idea of two, or of many, or even of none. Therefore, if in our quest for non-duality we state that all things are one God, we are limiting God. We are implying that he is not free to make or be something truly different from himself. And such a God is still dual, and for that very reason is in no way superior to the realm of duality or creation. On the other hand, the statement that all things are not God is by itself as dualistic as the statement that they are God. The God so conceived still fails to transcend the creaturely realm of duality. Orthodox theology, and especially theology in the tradition of Thomas, failed to see that God could include and even be many as well as one, because it regarded multiplicity and diversity as a privation and not a perfection of being. It saw diversity as the subjection of unity to division and disintegration. Particular things, men, trees, stones, and stars, were particular just because they lacked the fullness of being and expressed only a fragment of the divine being. But this was a wholly negative idea of particularity. It did not realize that particularity was a great and positive good, that God's expression of himself in particular things neither added to his being nor disintegrated it. It expressed the splendor of the divine unity in the splendor of variety, which, as the proverb says, is the spice of life. But the Neoplatonic background of medieval thought, tinged as it was with Manichaeism, held a prejudice against variety and multiplicity. It was the old story of world hatred, so inconsistent with the religion of the incarnation. Thus, God's othering of himself in the creation is not, as in pantheism, Maya, an illusion. The multiplicity is as real as the unity, since the creature is one with God in the very act of being other than God. Thus, we must change the meaning of the statement that God made the world out of nothing and understand the nothing as the nothing sunyata, the unutterable mystery, the divine darkness, which is God himself, as he appears to human sense and thought and feeling. For this seeming void, this no thing intelligible to the human mind, and its dualistic mode of thought is God, as he is absolutely in himself beyond all duality, neither one nor many, nor both one and many, and yet with equal reality one and many, and both one and many, 22 human speech cannot surpass its own inherent duality. The attempt to conceive a being beyond all duality swiftly brings thought to the limits of its power and reduces philosophy and theology to silence before the mystery of God. But it does leave us with some positive concepts, as true as any idea of God, any formulation of the infinite can be. Firstly, it lays greater stress than ever upon the divine freedom. For every form of pantheism, God's manifestation of himself in the universe is necessary, because the universe, if simply identical with God, must be as eternal as God. But to say that God is non-dual is another way of saying that he is free absolutely. He is free to be one, not bound to be one. He is free to include diversity in his unity, free to other himself. This othering of himself is the free gift of his being to creatures who otherwise might not have existed. And these creatures are in reality other than God. If they were not God, could not be said to give his being to others, and would not be free to include real diversity in his unity. Thus, non-duality means that God is entirely free from the essential limitation of finite existence, which is that a creature cannot at once be itself and another. More than ever, the creature may thank God for the free gift of life and being, not only because it might not have been given, but also because the gift is God. Secondly, the idea of God's non-duality is a new way of understanding his love. For love is not simply, as St. Thomas suggests, 23, the willing of another's good. It is giving oneself entirely to another being. 24. God's creation of a being is one and the same act as his love for it. In truth, he becomes one who is in truth other than himself. Thus, a creature fulfills God's love and will for itself, not by being or trying to be God, but by itself. This is true cooperation with God, because in that creature, God is not being himself. He is being another. If by this means the creature fulfills God's will and love, the more it is truly and distinctly itself, the more it is truly God. For in so doing, it is a burden and manifesting God's non-duality, his freedom to be what is not himself, his freedom to be more than mere oneness. Thus, one of the most interesting traits of mysticism is that those who have experienced most keenly their union with God are intensely real and unique personalities. This corrects one of the most usual perversions of mysticism, the attempt to become one with God by mere precocial life and experience. It is a perversion because it is a half-truth. Certainly, mysticism begins with the contemplation of God as transcendent, because God is the maker of all sensible and intelligible things. He himself can neither be sensed nor known. As transcendent, he can never be an object of experience or knowledge, and conversely, no particular experience or state of mind can be the immediate knowledge of God. 25, for all experiences and states of mind belong to the realm of duality and are mutually exclusive. Thus, the mystical experience is neither a particular state of mind, nor for this too has an opposite mere blankness of mind. Like the mirror, which reveals all images, yet is not itself an image, the mystical experience underlies and is one with all experience, as is God himself. When Dionysius speaks of knowing God through agnosia, or unknowing, he means that we may know God in all things through not knowing him in any. The mystic, he explains, by the very fact of not seeing and not knowing God, truly enters into him who is beyond sight and knowledge, knowing this too, that he is in all things that are felt and known. 26. The state of union, like God himself, has no opposite. It is all-inclusive, for which reason any experience may participate in it. Therefore, we discover the union of ourselves and of the creation with God through the very realization that they are themselves and not God. His very transcendence im present schiedwen montom. Anyway, the deathspecium, the dislocation of the future heavian transnactor. Children may say, du hast Christen zitten med det. Det är mer än känt vad jag tis. 27. The distinct individual reality of things is the very measure of their union with God, of their fulfillment and expression of his freedom to include diversity, to love and be what is other than himself. For this reason, and not because he is a pantheist, the mystic apprehends all things as one with God. He does not see the reality of God behind the illusion of the creature. He sees God in the very reality, entity, and uniqueness of the creature, in its very distinction from God. 28. Any view which stresses the unity of the universe with God will in some quarters be termed pantheistic, and any formal denial of pantheism will be called merely verbal. But strictly speaking, pantheism is the very Dinite doctrine that God and the universe are coterminous, that God is solely immanent, and that God minus the universe equals nothing. Such a doctrine is not only inconsistent with Christian dogma, but also with the theology of the Vedanta and Mahayana Buddhism, all of which insist that the ultimate reality is in Veoba, going free from all necessity and limitation, and that its existence would in no way be objected by the dissolution of the universe. True pantheism holds furthermore to a necessary identity of God and the universe, whereas all doctrines holding the immutability of God do and must maintain that the very existence of the universe is absolutely unnecessary, which is probably the real meaning of the Hindu concept of Maya. Since by definition the infinite cannot be subject to any constraint, the existence as well as the union of finite beings with it must be entirely gratuitous. Thus, the essential distinction between the doctrines of non-duality and pantheism is that the former, conceiving God as imprinted, regards his union with the universe as a free act of grace, whereas the latter, conceiving him to be no more than a universe of finite and composite beings, regards it as necessary. Certainly there is the danger that men may presume upon this freely given union, but in the hands of evil men, any truth may be dangerous. From the standpoint of non-duality, evil is not and cannot be the opposite of God. Yet this is just what evil wishes to be, opposing God in the entirely futile hope that it can exclude him, stand over against him and limit him as an equal. This is its tremendous conceit. Therefore, the supremacy of God over evil requires that it should never be allowed to achieve this aim. Evil tries to oppose God, but if God were to oppose evil, he would not only be acknowledging it as an equal and opposite, but allowing it to fulfill its purpose. Hence, it is not by opposing evil that God renders it through his non-duality, his all-futile. He overcomes inclusiveness, his love which is unconquerable and supreme, because it does not oppose and cannot intusively be opposed.